Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's great to see everybody here in the room. Welcome to those of you who are watching online. Also, welcome to those who are watching this in a time shift mode on the recording later. It's great to be back with you. I'm Reverend Mark Gilbert with the Centers of Spiritual Living, and as I come and visit with you guys periodically, I'm great honored to be with you today. And we're going to be exploring the topic, thoughts are things, but with a question mark after it. And the question marks, we're going to ask some questions about what the heck does that mean? Thoughts are things. We're going to look at it, where that saying come from, because we all know it. We're also going to look at what does it mean? And then how can we actually apply it in our life? How can it be a good reminder for us? And that's where we're going for the next few minutes. But just sort of a programming note before I launch into that is, I'm here every couple of months, but I'm going to be here next week as well. So you can use that as a warning or an enticement. I'll leave that up to you to decide. And because it's the first Sunday of the month, you have a gathering after the service where we do a meditation and have Q&A and discussion. And so I'm looking forward to that. So it's going to be kind of fun too. I love doing dialogue around our philosophy and seeing what we think about it and other people think about it and going deeper with it. I think that's really where we can take what we listen to on Sundays and in presentations like this and really say, well, how can I apply this in my life? And what do I really think and believe about it? Okay, so hope to see you next week. If you're in the Denver area, instead of being online, come on down here and join in the post-celebration discussions. Thoughts are things. We've all heard this phrase if we're in New Thought. And in fact, when you hear it, it becomes one of those memes. This is an ancient 100-year-old meme that a catchphrase, a subtitle. There's a number of them that we use in New Thought. You probably hear other phrases like change your thinking, change your life. We've probably heard the ideal made real, or using the law of attraction. And there's plenty more of these that we could get into, but there's little catchphrases that we use as a reminder of some essential truths that are underlying some of our philosophy. And by the very nature, that we use things like what we resist persists, is a quick reminder to ourselves that there's aspects of the world that are something that we need to take a look at in our life and change our thinking around. And so as I was putting today's presentation together, one of the things I thought about was, where the heck did this statement come from? And so I looked back and did some research. And now I've done a lot of, I work on the board of the Science of Mind Archives and do a lot of research work for them. And I've done a lot of Ernest Holmes research. So I thought I would start with Ernest Holmes. Now, for those of you who may be new to the philosophy, Ernest Holmes is the founder of Science of Mind. It's a flavor of New Thought. New Thought's an American spiritual philosophy that came up in the late 1800s, although it has its roots going back to thousands of years ago to ancient Greece and Rome and Egypt and things of that nature. But philosophies through the years have brought it forth. But it became something that sort of coalesced into New Thought in the late 1800s. Ernest Holmes was a writer in the first part of the 20th century, and he created the philosophy Science of Mind, which is centers for spiritual living in all our communities. Although we're open to so many philosophies and metaphysical thoughts and truth wherever we find it, our underpinning that comes from Ernest Holmes. And so when I thought about thoughts or things, the very first thing I thought about is I had a little book on my shelf called Thoughts or Things by Ernest Holmes. And I thought, well, maybe I should start there by looking at that book. And so I pulled it off my shelf and hadn't actually looked at it in a little while. And one of the things I realized right off the bat, it's a great little book, first off, but it was one of the books that came out after Ernest Holmes died. And how can books come out after Ernest Holmes passed? No, he died back in 1960, but he was so prolific. He wrote magazine articles, scripts for radio shows, TV shows, phonograph records, etc. He had tons of content. In fact, we're still bringing a lot of it out and transcribing and bringing it out these days. But in the 1950s, there was a gentleman by the name of Willis Kinnear who became the editor of the Science of Mind magazine for the organization. And he served in that capacity up until in the 1970s. And one of the things that he did late in Ernest's life and after Ernest passed was to take a lot of the writings of Holmes and edit them and massage them into books. And so every year they came out with a new, what they called Science of Mind Annual, where there would be some topic and some discussion of New Thought philosophy with writings of Holmes, oftentimes mixed with some edited content from other people. And the book Thoughts Are Things by Ernest Holmes is a book that Willis Kinnear, this editor, put out after Ernest's death. where he basically on one page will be, here's a worldly condition or problem that we all face. And then on the facing page would be an edited writing from Ernest Holmes that addressed that issue. Nowhere in the book does it really talk about the concept, thoughts, or things. It's implied in all of the writings that our thoughts create reality. And so, that's the book, Thoughts Are Things. I said, well, okay, that really doesn't answer the question for me. So I went back and used my other research tools and found tons of quotes from Ernest about where he used the phrase thoughts are things. But I got to confess, I knew when I was going in and looking back at Ernest's work, I knew that he wasn't the origin of the phrase, that it was something that was already in that soupy mixture of consciousness that was New Thought in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And in fact, I had encountered the phrase in research I had done on Christian D. Larson, on William Walker Atkinson, who wrote the Kabbalion, and other New Thought writers, and had encountered this phrase many times. So I knew it was already in the mix with the New Thought crowd. And but luckily, a colleague of mine, Mitch Horowitz, who does a lot of writing, wrote for the magazine for many years, and he wrote a really good history of New Thought a few years ago called One Simple Idea. Now, when people ask me what's a good history book to understand New Thought, I say, go get this book, because Mitch, he includes aspects that are not included in some of the other histories. He brings it more up to date. He also has a critical eye. He shows some of the warts in some of the people who were in New Thought in some of the early days, and which is good to know about. And he also, in that book, explores, does this concept of using the power of thought, does it really work? Is positive thinking an effective tool? And then, I will give you the spoiler alert, he does feel like it does work. So, but in that book, he has an aside about where did the phrase thoughts are things come from. And in his research, just one thing I want to say, that I love this book because, and this is a selfish egoic statement, I'll just say that, is that he actually has an acknowledgement of me in his book because I helped him with some research on Christian D. Larson, where I had done some research and he wanted to know where I got the stuff and so forth. But anyway, in that particular book, Mitch researched the origin of the phrase that we use, thoughts are things. And he realized the first time he could find somebody using that phrase in the New Thought movement, or in the people who were writing of this New Thought kind of dialogue, was a guy by the name of Warren Felt Evans in the late 1800s. In fact, I think it was in the 1870s. But it was just an aside. It was just a phrase in a sentence, and he didn't anchor and emphasize it. Okay. Now, I have no doubt that somewhere in the history of humanity, somebody used the phrase thoughts are things before that, but nobody really popularized it until there was a guy in the late 1800s named Prentice Mulford. Everybody know Prentice Mulford? And he's not a well-known New Thought author, but he's an interesting character because he grew up in Long Island area in New York, inherited his family business, which then had some struggles, and he left that and became somebody who worked on merchant ships for many years, sailing around and supporting ships for many years of his life. And he ended up in San Francisco during the gold rush days in the 1800s and tried his bit at panning for gold and mining gold, and realized he could make more money working for a local newspaper in San Francisco. And there he became sort of a commentary, humorist writer, commenting on the events of the day. Sort of sounds like another person that if you're familiar with American history, it would make you think of Mark Twain, who ended up in San Francisco in the mining area and so forth. In fact, there's a number of similarities, because after he left San Francisco and he went back east, he was a traveling humorist and giving humorous stories and things of that nature. But he also liked writing, and he made enough money that and this will remind you of Thoreau. He took his money and went out of the woods of New Jersey and built himself a small cabin and lived there and started writing. And he started writing these essays. The essays, he then wanted to find a publisher for, and he went up to Boston and found somebody who was going to be publishing, would help him publish the stuff. And so his essays started coming out in a series of New Thought magazines. I'll say magazines, but they're very short pamphlets with just one article in them. And they were called the White Cross Library, the White Cross Library. And this is probably fascinating to the history nerds in the room, but what he actually did was, and I just got to make an aside on this, because you can't look at this and you go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. How do people nowadays, if they want to communicate their ideas out in the world, we write a blog. We go online, we get a blog, we get a YouTube channel, we put our words out and online, and it's very quick to do that. But back in the day, if you were in the late 1800s, early 1900s, what you did, you published a magazine. And there were tons of New Thought magazines in the late 1800s. Everybody who was anybody who had any thought about New Thought, they either wrote for a magazine or published their own magazine. Well, Prentice Mulford, he actually wrote these White Cross Library publications, and they became so popular that the articles were aggregated into a series of 6 books, and they were called Your Mental Forces and How to Use Them, a phrase that later was taken by Christian D. Larson for a popular book in the 20th century, by the way. But they had 6 volumes of these essays. Now, the reason I go into this sort of detail is this kind of an interesting thing. Mulford passed away in 1891, and he was found on a boat floating out right off the coast of New Jersey. He was planning on taking a boating trip, and they found that there was a boat just floating out there. They went out and found him. He had died in the boat, and it was under mysterious things. There were some interesting newspaper articles speculating on what happened to Mulford. But after his death, they published one more volume of his collected works in this 6-volume thing where they were bringing together the White Cross stuff. And so what does this got to do with Thoughts Are Things? One of his essays was called Lilies of the Field. And in the bottom of every page of that thing, he had the phrase, thoughts are things. It was like the meme in his blog type article of his magazine. And that's interesting in and of itself that he did that, because he would pull out little phrases in several of his issues to give little quick snapshot phrases to anchor in what he was trying to teach in that article. When Mulford passed away, an interesting coincidence is they took some of his better essays and published them into a book called Thoughts Are Things. Just like Holmes has a book called Thoughts Are Things published after his passing, which I thought was an interesting coincidence. One final quote on Mulford is that when he died, his headstone says not only his name, but says the words "thoughts are things" on his gravestone. So he's the one who originated the phrase and popularized it, and it got into the mixture of all our early New Thought writers, and everybody picked that phrase up and started using it. But what does it mean? What does it mean? What does it do for us? And I know that when we all heard it, I can react from my own perspective. And when I first heard that phrase, I thought, yeah, it's a great reminder that I have this aspect of an inner awareness where I'm thinking and having thoughts. And that inner awareness is connected to this outer world that I'm moving around in. These are the things out here, and there's these thoughts that I'm having in my inner awareness. And there is a connection. If these thoughts are things, there is a bridge between my inner awareness and my outer awareness. Now, you may have a different take on how you use the phrase or thought about the phrase, but for me, it was an anchoring of the awareness that we have these 2 realms in which we experience life, and they're connected. That our inner world is connected with our outer world. It's connected to the power of thoughts. Okay. Now, this is this question of the connection or bridge between our inner world and our outer world is one that humanity has really studied for eons, thousands of years. And in fact, from a philosophical standpoint, philosophers, scientists, religious leaders have all studied what's really real between all of this. And on the one hand, there are these people who, and especially back in some of the early religious traditions, felt like the only thing that was really real was the inner awareness, the thoughts, the consciousness. From a philosophical standpoint, we call these the idealist, because they think that it's only this ideal in mind is the only truth. The downside for the idealist position, of course, is that we walk around, we hit our toe on a rock, it hurts. This physical stuff is giving us feedback all the time that it's not an illusion. There is a degree of reality about the physical life that we're living. So to say that everything is only mental and there's nothing physical, and this is just Maya or an illusion, Well, there's a part of us that doesn't buy that. We think here's some reality. Try to live your life ignoring physical reality. You'll have a very difficult time. On the other hand, there's the people who think the only reality is physical stuff. In fact, this is a prominent position for many people in modern life today. And these are called materialists. Everything is physical matter. It's only the stuff. It's only the things that are real. And so materialists walk around and say, the fact that we have an inner awareness, it's an illusion in some regards. Or they like to use the big word epiphenomenon of consciousness. Of what they say, for many who think that things are only physical matter, is that through the process of physical matter evolving over time, there was some biological evolutionary reason as to why brains got bigger and thoughts got deeper and something emerged. And that emergence was consciousness. And consciousness is simply an epiphenomenon, which means byproduct. It's a byproduct that may or may not have an evolutionary purpose. Now, this is sort of like the modern thought of a lot of materialistic scientists. And they believe that there's no inner world. There's no true inner world. It's an illusion that we make up through this biological mechanism. Now, this has its downsides as well for a lot of folks. And this was really self-evident to me when I read a recent book. It's called, I'm not recommending the book, but you can read it if you think this is interesting after I tell you about it. It's called Fluke. It came out a few months ago. And the author of the book, he writes about, and I'd say the first 2/3 of the book, I really enjoyed it because it was all about chaos theory. Chaos theory is that aspect that we summarize it by saying it's where the butterfly wings flap in Brazil and it changes the weather in Japan or some sort of variation of that story. What it gets at is the fact that everything in life, everything in the material world is interconnected. And that one small change over here can have a big impact over here. We'd like to think of it in terms of all it takes is one small group of people whose consciousness and actions can change the planet. That there are small things that can make big differences because of this interconnected nature of the universe. And that's what his book was about, in tying together. And he goes through a really beautiful process of describing chaos theory, which you can find in other books as well. But in the final couple of chapters of the book, he then makes this leap. Now, again, I'm saying there's two ends of the spectrum. Everything's either mind or everything's physical stuff. And he makes a statement in his book that says, any rational person with the scientific training would realize that consciousness is physical. Okay. And I said, well, maybe not, was my take when I read the sentence. But he went on from there to say, and because of that, that we don't have free will, that we can't make choices, that everything is predetermined. That's called determinism in a philosophical argument. His argument is, I'm going to oversimplify and oversummarize it for the purposes of our awareness this morning. But what he said was, if you can think that in the Big Bang, everything was set in motion in matter. And because of that, everything was predetermined. Everything knew where, you can sort of think like billiard balls, trillions and gazillions of billiard balls on a vast table, and you shoot the cue ball. And now everything is already in motion, and it's just going to continue moving in the direction that it's all going. Hence, the patterns and how things are going to play out are already predetermined from the very beginning, from the very beginnings of the universe. Well, I look at that and go, maybe not. You know, to me, I had the same questions of that as I did of the idealist saying the physical reality is not real. To say that everything is simply physical and it's like billiard balls and everything is played out. Because where we go with that idea is that our consciousness simply arose based on this pattern of things hitting, and our thoughts and choices that we think we're making free will choices, they're not in this argument. They're all something that are going to arise naturally because of the way things are knocking around. Does that make sense? So you may be arguing with it in your mind like I did, but the point is that everything if everything is physical matter, we're only going to see a play out of a set. The future is already set, and we can't change it. Well, that doesn't resonate with me, which leaves, if these are the two, what's the third one? And the third argument is that both are real. And the question then becomes, how do they interact? how does the inner world interact with the physical world if they're both real? And this is called dualism in the philosophical aspect. And then you've probably heard of the phrase, the hard problem. It was founded by a philosopher in the 20th century named David Chalmers. To define the hard problem is to actually figure out, how does matter interact with inner awareness? How does brains and our sense of being a person and our thoughts, how are they connected? How can you sit here and feel like you're in this room or you're online watching this program and have that awareness? And it's interacting with your physical body and your physical nature. And this is the so-called hard problem that science has yet to answer. So how does this relate to the statement, thoughts are things? You may have thought I forgot all about that. But to me, what we're saying with the word thoughts or things is we're trying to bridge in a sort of dualistic nature, a realization that both our inner world and our outer world are real. And the connection is through consciousness. And I think part of the reason that many people find that the aspect of explaining the connection between our inner world and outer world being a hard problem is because they want to think of it in terms of our physical brains causing consciousness. But what many people, including Ernest Holmes and many people in New Thought, have taught is that consciousness was created from a divine source, and that consciousness is in everything, and that everything is a flow or dynamic expression of consciousness. And so what happens in a sense, it is a dual model. But ultimately, Ernest Holmes and most New Thought teachers say, but the ultimate reality is in our awareness, in our consciousness. And that what we are doing in a material form is simply having that human experience as a sort of teaching playground for us to grow and learn and make choices, free will choices, that we can interject into the world. Now, interestingly enough, a lot of times when you first come into Science of Mind, you may think that it's only our thoughts that are creative, because Holmes says that a lot. But Holmes also made a distinction between what he called primary causes and secondary causes. The billiard balls that are knocking around out in the world, where one thing causes another thing, Holmes called those secondary causes. Now, can we introduce a new thought to change the path of a secondary cause? And we teach yes, because of the interconnectedness of the fact that we can take our thinking, make a choice, and introduce it into the physical world and change the reality. So the path of thoughts or things is a way of reminding us that we have the ability to intercede a thought into the physical world through our thinking, through our inner mental world. Now, the interesting thing about a lot of this is I want to paint one more picture in your mind about this concept. And that is the fact that Holmes and others like to say that thoughts are spirit or God in a non-solid state. We can sort of think of this as like water existing as ice, water, and steam, or is the humidity in the air around us. God in its purest state is not in a material form. And so it's like the humidity in the room we're in right now. We can't see it, but it's there. But at some point, that the molecules of the moisture that are in the air can coalesce and come into a state that can be melded into something. That's a liquid state. And similarly, thoughts in their most purest form are floating in the room, but they can come into a liquid state and then be firmed up into a solid state like ice, taking on a temporary nature, so that the things that we're sensing as physical items, this podium, this equipment, the chairs we're sitting on, our bodies, they're all temporary states of physicalness where spirit has been frozen into the forms that we're experiencing. And so they're temporary. They're not permanent. And at some point, they will break down and dissolve back into a complete cycle, into the liquid and then back into the state of the ether, into a total sense of non-form. So using this model of water, forming steam, water, and ice, we can think of our minds and our thoughts in the same way. That everything is embedded with consciousness, everything is embedded with moisture, okay? And that when we think, our thoughts are a movement within consciousness, and that's how Holmes like to describe our thinking. Thinking is taking this base that's underneath us continuously and introducing a movement into it. We're making things move. We're making the water move. We're making the water move from a state of steam to liquid to solid through the very nature of our thinking. So the thoughts are the ways in which we create an interaction or a bridge between the world of our inner world and our outer world. Okay. So I know this is kind of heady stuff, but it's where my mind was when I thought about thoughts or things. And I want to bring this in the final moments here back to some reality. How do we use this dense knowledge? How do we do this? Well, if I could cut to the chase about what they're saying, is that everything is one. What we experience is the outer world and the inner world are one. Consciousness is under everything. The power of us having the ability to choose our thoughts is what moves the consciousness to allow the change from the realm of the non-form into the realm of form. And that's why we teach the power of thinking. So how do we employ this in our lives? How can we use the phrase, thoughts are things, in our lives? And so if everything I've said up to this point is like, what? This is the part where maybe it will apply to your life. Thoughts are things. When you hear that phrase or you say it to yourself, first off, use it as a reminder that what we see out in the world, physical aspects of the world, have a bridge and connection to our inner world. They're not separate and apart. They're connected. So the very first thing, thoughts are things, is a reminder of the oneness of the two realms we find ourselves navigating around in all the time. Second way you can use the phrase, thoughts are things, is to remind yourself that by the nature of what I'm choosing to think, I am choosing what occurs in my life. And that's what most of our classes are about using that aspect of looking and holding up our thoughts to the light to see if they still serve us. So if things in our life are not as we desire, to ask the question, where in my thinking do I need to look at this? Now, I don't want to overstress that we got to be, thought cops that are watching our thoughts every moment and saying, oh, shouldn't have thought that, shouldn't have thought that. What we have to do is look at the tendency of our thoughts. Take some time each day to reflect on what I'm thinking about and how is what I'm thinking about out picturing in my life. If my thoughts are really things and they're leading to my physical reality, then how can I shift what I'm thinking about to more manifest the reality that I desire? So it's a bridge to connect the inner and the outer. It's a way to remind ourselves that if we change our thinking, we can change the outer. There's another way we can look at this, is that if everything is in a steam to liquid to solid state, what does it tell us about the things that are around us right now? That they're temporary. They're only here for a while. Are there things you're enjoying? Bless them and enjoy them, but also don't get so attached to them that it makes it difficult for you to release them when it's time for their natural path to move into the next stage of whatever they're to be. Death, divorce, job loss, events that we have in our life, they're all temporary forms that are there for that experience. But we tend to, as humans, want to keep that and cling to that. And we need to remember through the state that thoughts are things, is that that's a temporary process of a continuous flow. Things in your life are not what you want. This too will pass. It's a temporary thing and it's not going to be there forever. If you're experiencing difficulties in your life, give it time, continue focusing on the positive, and recognize that everything in our life passes, the good and the bad. Okay. And the final thing that I want to suggest to you, and this is probably the more difficult one to do, is when we hear the phrase thoughts are things, it is a reminder that thoughts have this interplay with the material world. But where are we actually? Where's our truth? Our truth is in the spiritual world. And as long as we are focused on our thoughts, we're focused on the interplay in the material. So much of our processes here are spiritual practices to tap you into your truth. So part of the process is changing the thinking for our physical lives to change. But part of the process is to stop our thinking to enjoy the spiritual life. We often hear about the fact that in meditation, we sit in meditation to stop thinking, to hold up the flow of consciousness. Consciousness is there, but when we're thinking, we're giving movement to it. When we stop thinking, we're allowing ourselves to get into practicing the presence of the divine that is there all the time, because God in the consciousness, the non-moving consciousness, the ever-present consciousness of the divine is a presence that's in our lives all the time. So thoughts or things can be a reminder to also occasionally stop our thoughts so that we don't focus on the things, and that we can rather anchor our awareness into the truth of the divine of who we are. It's hard to stop your thinking. It is. One of the best practices that I have found for doing that in the beginning is to do a meditation called the gap. And what you're looking for is to recognize and focus on your thinking at the very beginning, where you have, oh, that's a thought, and that's a thought. And then that you're called to take your attention and focus on the space between the two thoughts. Now, this sounds kind of crazy when you first hear it, but there actually is a slight gap when you're thinking one thing and you go to the next thing you're thinking about, and you go to the next. There is a little space there. And if you can turn your attention in the quietness of the day into the meditation, into that little gap between your thinking, and feel what that feels like. I mean, I know what it feels like for me. There is a silence. There is a spaciousness. There is a timelessness. There's also an interesting sort of sound in the background that I can't quite describe that comes up for me. But when I hear it, I know I am getting into the space and I'm allowing the thoughts to stop. And when I can get there, I have experiences that remind me that my truth is more than this physical form. It's more than this body mark and the world story that I tell myself, that I am so much greater than that. So our call this week, as I conclude, is for you to remember thoughts are things. And as you remember thoughts are things, remember that's a bridge between the inner world and the outer world. It's a reminder to shift your thinking to the direction that you can create the reality you want. It's a reminder that the things in our life are temporary in nature, that all of them, the good and the bad, will change. And it's a reminder to often take time to stop our thinking so that we can touch into and know God at a deeper and higher level. So let's pray. Let's just move into that space this moment where we shift our focus outward, the world of things, into the world of the inner world. We have thoughts with our thinking in this moment to allow us to move towards the higher understanding of our oneness of all it is. We know there's only one life, one God, one power, one presence, one divine essence that moves in and through us and gives us our very existence. These forms that we call ourselves by our names are a beautiful gift, joy, and growth with this human time here on planet Earth. But we also know that we're called through our awareness to live and grow and to become the highest expression of who we can be. We know that not only is that out manifesting in our physical lives to the highest expression of whatever it is that we are called to be in the world of form, but it's also to move inward into our greater awareness of our divine nature at the anchoring of our truth. And so I know for each and every one of you that the lives that you are expressing this week and continuing forward are a life of divine guidance and gifts and goodness. But I also know that you're guided inward to touching and knowing the sense that you are, in truth, a divine being. Thank you, thank you, thank you, God. And I release these words into the law, knowing that they are so, and so it is.